We've generally talked about the American dream and American identity through the lens of white writers, but I think it's worthwhile to think about what this idea means to African American writers. So for this week, we are going to do a brief, very brief survey of African American literature and look at some examples where the American dream, the idea of the American dream shows up in their writing. And we're beginning with a folk tale called All God's Children Had Wings. This is a story, you should have read this story. It's a story about Africans who have newly arrived in America, arrived into their enslavement. And one of the things that we've talked about quite a lot this semester has been the idea of the relationship between land and nature and opportunity and the American dream. And of course, that was a really important idea for voluntary immigrants to the United States. Land could provide opportunity, and this discourse, this mythos of the American dream was very tightly connected to that. Industriousness and labor could lead to progress, and clearly that was not the outcome for African Americans who were brought here in order to be slaves. And so we don't see a whole lot of nature in the same respect in the writings of African American authors that we do among whites. And in this story, we can see how labor is not voluntary, and it's certainly not for the purpose of upward mobility. It's coercive. It's for survival. And as a result, there is not the same connection to the land in African American writings. Of course, we see in this folktale, and there are different ways to interpret this folktale, and we're not going to go into a lot of the interpretation because my students, even in sophomore lit, usually can do a pretty good job with this story. But we see that they have this dream of liberation. It shows up in the folktales, in the spirituals as well. This same hunger for freedom, but a hunger that will not be satiated by the institution of slavery, that will always be denied. And in this story, we see liberation, but that liberation, what manner and into what, is very ambiguous. Some students read it as a mass suicide, that death was preferable to slavery, that freedom in the earthly realm was inaccessible, so they would strive for freedom in the afterlife. It's possible that this folktale is rooted in another story in America, which is the story of Ibu Landing. That word there, IGBO, is pronounced Ibu, which was the story of a mass suicide. As the story goes, a slave ship arrived on the coast, and as the slaves who survived disembarked and saw what awaited them, they chose to walk into the sea in an act of mass suicide rather than confront what awaited them. So perhaps the story is rooted in some history, some historical narrative, but it certainly speaks to that same desire for freedom that drove all of America, was the promise of America, but was denied a particular subset of the population whose enslavement defined their very existence. We read Frederick Douglass's narrative and his similar quest for freedom, and that idea that he's drawing from the master narratives that were circulating at the time was the connection between freedom and manhood. You have seen how a man was made a slave. You shall see how a slave is made a man. And so his freedom was not just the physical liberation from slavery, it was the sort of ontological liberation, the opportunity to have human dignity, access to self-definition and autonomy, to choose one's destiny, and live a life filled with human dignity. And that's a lot of what Crevecoeur was talking about, this idea, here we can be men. What is this American, this new man? And Frederick Douglass is clearly a model of the American Adam, the new man, the self-creation, liberation, habits of behavior that allowed him to redefine himself, sort of encapsulated in the change of name and the movement to the north, and then his dedication to abolitionism, to testify against the institution of slavery, which gave him power. Literacy, the ability to testify, gave him power. So I want to talk a little bit about this idea of the American dream as we see it in Charles Chesnutt's short story, The Wife of His Youth. One of the themes that runs through African American literature is this quest for racial uplift, for social progress, and respectability is an important part of that conversation. Langston Hughes defines it this way. When in his essay, The Negro Artist and the Racial Mountain, he talks about this is the mountain standing in the way of any true Negro art in America. And this is relevant not just to the production of art, but to all aspects of Black life. The urge within the race toward whiteness. The desire to pour racial individuality into the mold of American standardization, and to be as little Negro and as much American as possible. We see this same theme in The Wife of His Youth. Because in this story, we have Mr. Ryder, who is the dean of the Blue Blood Society. And the Blue Blood Society, that's hard to say. The Blue Blood Society is an organization of lighter-skinned African Americans, and they socialize together, and they marry one another, and they have children who are even lighter-skinned, and they aspire to white respectability. And that word respectability can be interchanged with the word, in many cases, acceptability, becoming acceptable to America by aspiring to whiteness, by aspiring to white culture. And in this story, literally aspiring to whiteness, being light-skinned and marrying people who are light-skinned to have offspring that is even lighter-skinned, right? And so Mr. Ryder, with his standard white English and his poetry, spends his life aspiring to respectability as a mechanism for upward mobility. And when the wife from his past, who we're told is very dark-skinned, who speaks in dialect, who works as a cook, comes looking for her husband. He has this dilemma about whether to, she doesn't recognize him, whether to deny her and marry the other respectable woman, Mrs. Dixon, or to embrace him, to embrace her, to take her in. Figuratively, to embrace his past, to quit denying his past, to embrace his identity, and to embrace his heritage. And he decides to embrace his heritage. But we're left to wonder, does that limit his prospects for upward mobility? That if he embraces blackness, his history, as it is represented by having been married to an enslaved woman who is not refined and sophisticated, does that limit his prospects in American society? Does the American dream require that he deny himself? And that answer is open-ended, but certainly we can consider what we think the answer to it is. The Souls of Black Folk by W.B. Du Bois is really one of the most important works in African American literature. It's sort of in his conversation in this collection of essays. Du Bois really is able to crystallize a lot of the crisis of identity that plagued him, and that he believes, he argues, I think rightly so, plagues African American society. And this quote sort of encapsulates all of that. The Negro is a sort of seventh son, born with a veil and gifted with second sight. In this American world, a world which yields him no true self-consciousness, but only lets him see himself through the revelation of the other world. And he's talked about this being behind the veil, this veil that separates the races, and veils obscure and distort what is behind them, and that has led to him to a world which yields him no true self-consciousness, but only lets him see himself through the revelation of the other world. It is a peculiar sensation, this double consciousness, this sense of always looking at oneself through the eyes of the other, of measuring oneself by the tape of a world that looks on in amused contempt and pity. One ever feels his two-ness, an American, a Negro, two souls, two thoughts, two unreconciled strivings, two warring ideals in one dark body, whose dogged strength alone keeps it from being torn asunder. So this idea of double consciousness, these two identities, both Negro in the language of Du Bois's time and American, these two identities that are in conflict, because he must see himself as he is, but he also must see himself as he is seen, right? Du Bois had a PhD. He was the first African American to receive a PhD from Harvard, and so he sees himself as this accomplished, intelligent, intellectual, but he knows that the world sees him as a black man, right? First and foremost, that what he accomplishes will never overshadow how he is seen. And he knows that despite his accomplishments, that the world may be looking on in amused contempt and pity. He's always having to measure himself against the tape of that other world. We can see this idea carry through and maybe clarify it a little bit in Dunbar's poem, We Wear the Mask. We wear the mask that grins and lies. It hides our cheek and shades our eyes. This debt we pay to human guile while with torn and bleeding hearts we smile and mouth with myriad subtleties. Right, and so Dunbar is talking about the same concept, but he's saying it in a different way. We have to wear this mask. And with these torn and broken hearts, we smile. Right, so the distinction there, that the smile hides the inner pain. But we're required to wear this mask to play this role as a survival mechanism. Really closely related to this idea of double consciousness, these two identities that are at war with one another. I've included the dates on many of these so you can see the progression over time. So up until this point, we've been talking we talked about the slavery era, and then we moved into the Jim Crow era, where opportunities were limited. Social movement, economic movement was all governed by racial stratification. And when we get into James Baldwin, this essay that you read, My Dungeon Shook, we are moving into the civil rights movement era, where the delay of opportunity, of justice, of freedom by the civil rights movement were going on 100 years since the Civil War, since emancipation, and the constant effort to deny freedom, equality, opportunity, economic security to the Black population, especially in the South, but not only in the South, begins to in his poem Harlem, Langston Hughes asks, what happens to a dream deferred? Does it dry up like a raisin in the sun, or does it fester and then run? And he ends with, or does it explode? And this promise of the American dream, ever denied, began to explode in the civil rights movement. And some of the historical forces that facilitated that were 2 world wars and the Cold War, right? I mean, both in World War I and in World War II, African American soldiers fought for freedom. America claimed that World War I was a war to make the world safe for democracy, and World War II was this fight against totalitarianism and this fight for justice and freedom at the cost of millions of lives. And then we go into the Cold War and the Vietnam War, where America is fighting for democracy and freedom against the totalitarian Russian Soviet oppressor. And when the national discourse focuses heavily, constantly on freedom and justice and equality, and you have a population who has served in war for that, who believes in that, but is denied that, something will give, like Langston Hughes says, or does it explode? And this is James Baldwin writing in a tradition in African American literature, which is the sort of the open letter, and he's writing a letter to his nephew, sharing his wisdom what he has learned. We see this show up in other works of literature. Richard Wright in Black Boy, he talks about his Jim Crow education, and that was his elders advising him on how to survive in the Jim Crow South, what is acceptable and what is unacceptable. More recently, Ta-Nehisi Coates wrote Between the World and Me, which is a National Book Award winner, where he's writing a book that is an open letter to his son. And so James Baldwin is utilizing this kind of model and warning his son, as he has grown, that he was not expected to aspire to excellence. You were expected to make peace with mediocrity. That sentence runs so counter to the American dream. Benjamin Franklin's 13 virtues: develop habits of behavior for excellence and you will excel. Jay Gatsby, with his own habits of behavior, his virtues that he practices in order to be successful. And Baldwin recognizes that he, Baldwin, and then the next generation, his nephew, was not expected to aspire to excellence. Excellence will get you in trouble. Richard Wright says very much the same thing in Black Boy and in his essay, The Ethics of Living Jim Crow. You should not aspire to excellence. You have to make peace with mediocrity. That's your method for survival. What I think is one of the most prescient and eloquent statements in literature, in African American literature, as it relates to current society, also comes from My Dungeon Shook. And Baldwin says that, tells his nephew that you will have to learn to accept them. That question of acceptability and respectability, don't wait to be accepted by them. You will have to accept them. And I mean that very seriously. You must accept them with love. For these innocent people have no other hope. That word innocent could be troubling, but he goes on to explain what he means by that. And this is the sentence that I find so prescient. They are, in effect, still trapped in a history which they do not understand. And until they understand it, they cannot be released from it. Earlier in the essay, you may have noticed this, he says something about a history that they don't know and they don't want to know. And I'm struck by this in the way in our current society we are beginning to see hear conversations about, again, this comes in waves, about book banning and about critical race theory and teaching race in the public schools, and a father who did not think his son should have to read Beloved because it made him uncomfortable. And we don't want children to have to grapple with a history that is uncomfortable, or with literature that is uncomfortable. And history and literature are uncomfortable. That's part of what they do, is they make us uncomfortable because they force us to confront uncomfortable things. But that is a people who are trapped in a history that they do not understand. And until they understand it, they can't be released from it. And it's a tragedy that all these years after Baldwin says that so eloquently, that we remain trapped in this history, afraid to confront the past, afraid to confront history, afraid to confront our mistakes, afraid to look at the promise of America and say, we have failed to live up to it in our past, so let's live up to it in our present and in our future. And that is clearly what we see when Martin Luther King gives his I Have a Dream speech, clearly connected to the idea of the American dream. He even says it. It is a dream deeply rooted in the American dream. And this call, this famous speech from the March on Washington, this beautiful, well-known American piece of rhetoric, taps into that desire for America to live up to its creed. We hold these truths to be self-evident that all men are created equal. That is the promise. So let's live up to the promise. And he, much like Winthrop, takes us back. He takes us back to Scripture. This idea of a new Israel, in a sense, maybe a little bit of a stretch, but he quotes Isaiah when God offers comfort to the Israelites and tells them that their hard service is done in the first few verses of Isaiah 40. And he quotes Isaiah here when he says that every valley shall be exalted, and every hill and mountain shall be made low. The rough places will be made plain, and the crooked places will be made straight. And the glory of the Lord shall be revealed, and all flesh shall see it together. The interconnection of faith and promise and opportunity that runs through the American meta-narrative, but also the African American meta-narrative. But Malcolm X, he recognizes there is this American dream, but we don't see any American dream. We've experienced only the American nightmare. We haven't benefited from America's democracy. We've only suffered from American hypocrisy. He's responding to King. He's responding to this rhetoric. This was the year following the March on Washington speech. And he too taps into this idea of a dream deferred. And so we can see how this promise of the American dream has been so integral to so much of the conversation in American literature. This promise of upward mobility. Crevecoeur, here we can have land, and that makes us citizens and it makes us men. Douglass, freedom from slavery will give rise to manhood, because this thing, the slave, is a different thing from a man. And then running all the way through, we can see it in Booker T. Washington's Up from Slavery, and in Paul Laurence Dunbar's poetry, in Jean Toomer's Cain, all the way through to contemporary works like Toni Morrison's novel Sula. The presence of this promise that is denied but is still cherished. Their antipathy to it doesn't mean that they don't embrace it and long for it. It gives it even more value.